أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الأطيبين الأطهرين الهداة المهديين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for that overly generous introduction. I'm not actually Dr. Sulayman, but just Sulayman. And there's a Persian proverb that perfume is that which a person can smell the fragrance of themselves, not that which has to be advertised and introduced. And so I don't think that introductions actually convey much, but I hope that I will be able to convey a few thoughts regarding the message that we can learn from the Quran during the nights that we have together, and that I will be able to benefit this gathering and also benefit from your participation. I do ask that you participate actively during and after my brief talks. Please recite salawat. One of the things that we have been introduced to this noble month of Ramadan as being is that it is the month of a divine invitation. It is the month of Dhiyafatullah, when we are guests and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our host. And this is the basic theme that I would like to focus on in light of the Quran. What does it mean? And what should it mean for us during the month of Ramadan to be guests of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And what kind of relationship should we have with our host? There is a custom in many countries, perhaps it's not that common in America, at least not today, but in many Middle Eastern countries where people have fancy walimas and invitations for weddings and other important events. In many villages and small cities, these events, they would be something that everybody would want to go to, because it would be their one opportunity to really eat a meal that would be memorable. Otherwise, they wouldn't have that opportunity. And so people would think up elaborate schemes, and I'm sure there's probably movies made about similar themes in America as well, but where they would be able to join in an invitation even if they were not invited and they didn't know any of the people there and they didn't know the host. And so they would go and then just play it by ear and try to make it seem as if they belonged, pretend that they knew what was going on. But they had no connection with the host and they had no connection with the other guests. Their connection was with the food and maybe the entertainment. And so as soon as that was done, they would leave, because they were not really guests. And that was not really a host that they were able to attend the invitation of and benefit from. We should not be in the month of Ramadan such a guest who kind of comes quietly and has a nice iftar or maybe a few invitations at a center or at friends' houses, but not actually be able to get to know our host and have a sense of a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we do this right during the month of Ramadan, then that relationship and the hosting, that will continue after the month of Ramadan. That is what a good invitation is. If you meet a friend, you go to someone's house, you may only be able to visit them and be in their company every few weeks or every few months, or in some cases every few years. But if you have a connection and you develop a relationship, then that occasional invitation, which is a close, personal, face-to-face invitation, its effects last for a very long time. In the month of Ramadan, every year, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invites us to that direct, quote-unquote, face-to-face invitation. But the effects of that are to remain with us for the remaining 11 months of the year and for the rest of our life. So that is what we are striving to do. And the way that I think that we can approach this issue is by looking at how it is possible for us to have a relationship and converse with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is something which many of us, we aren't really comfortable doing. There is a two-way street in a relationship. In an invitation, there is the relationship between the guest and the host, or on the part of the guest, how he or she relates to the host. And then there is another aspect of the relationship, how the host relates to the guest. A good relationship is where the two correspond. But there are some times when the guest or one friend has one view of the other, and the host has another idea. There are guests who sometimes overstay their welcome. They think they're coming to their friend's house or their relative's house, and that's their second home. And the host is thinking, well, 3 days, 4 days, maybe 5, but that's about it, and then they should leave. So there are times when the relationship is not reciprocal and it is not in correspondence. They have two different ideas. Our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also should not be such a relationship where we have one set of expectations and Allah has another set of expectations. For many of us, when it comes to our relationship with Allah, I can give an example from my own life. I don't know how many of you may be able to relate to it. My parents, they were from Pakistan. The first time that I went with them to Pakistan, I wasn't fluent in the language, and it was my first trip there. They were returning to their own home country. They had left it for a few years, but they were becoming reacquainted with family, friends, a culture that they had left, but that was always in their hearts. So the day they got to the country, they were right at home with the language, with the people, with the country. And when I went there, I was all of a sudden being introduced to a group of people, a room full of people. These are your relatives. Talk to them. We don't share a language. We don't know each other's interests. We don't know what to do. And so I was their guest. They were hosts, but I didn't know the first thing of what to do to break the ice. And so it might take a long time. And primarily it was them who were able to break the ice. So with us, when we come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we say that, all right, Ramadan is the month of a divine hosting. Spend the night of Laylatul Qadr talking to Allah. We'll sit there like we're sitting in a foreign country, and maybe everyone around us and our parents, they're comfortable, they're talking away, and we're just getting snippets of the conversation, and we're sitting there in a corner kind of isolated. What am I going to say to Allah? What am I going to talk to Allah about? What does He want to hear? What interests Him? And that example that I'm using, it's simply to convey an idea. That is, of course, not how we should picture and limit Allah and constrict Him in our minds. And then there is the relationship from Allah to us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also extends His hands and His grace to us. But for many of us, we don't appreciate that as well. It's kind of like if we have a group of friends and they are throwing us a surprise party, but they don't want us to know about it. And so all of a sudden their character, it might be different from how it normally is because they're thinking about us more. It's an important event for us. We're about to graduate. It's about to be our birthday or something, and they want to make it really special. And so they're talking among themselves. And when I call one of them up and say, I want to join you for lunch, I'm sorry, I'm busy. All of a sudden they're aloof. I approach them, and all of a sudden the conversation switches to something else. So there is a moment of silence. And sometimes people get suspicious as to what is going on. Their friends are planning and thinking something that would be truly meaningful for their friend, and the friend in whose honor all of that trouble is being taken and the efforts are being made, they might get suspicious and maybe even feel a little bit aloof from their friends because they don't understand that relationship. So on our part, when we approach Allah, sometimes our problem is that we don't know what to say and we don't know how to relate to Allah, and so we just kind of sit there in silence or repeat something on our tongues. And when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He intervenes in our life and when He wants to show that He is intervening in our life, we look at it with suspicion. Just like we might look at a friend with suspicion who is planning something to surprise us. If we had known what was going on and what was at the end of that wait, then we would have felt honored. But because we don't appreciate Allah's intervention, we don't appreciate how He is interacting with us, what He wants to accomplish for us, all of a sudden we feel as if He doesn't care for us, or He is ignoring our entreaties, our prayers, our thoughts, and so we actually may become distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when we should be appreciating His invisible hand in our lives more and more. So these are just a few very approximate and incomplete pictures of the problems that many of us face in our relationship with Allah. And I hope that as we talk through these nights, we will be able to work on these different areas. One more point that I would like to bring up is that in our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we should be able to develop that relationship both in public and among a circle of friends and also in private. Now, there are both extremes that many of us we may be able to actually relate to. There are some of us who, if we're with a group of friends and they say, let's recite a dua, let's do something, maybe it might be a charitable project or some community service, or even a dua, some act of worship, then we're motivated. But if I find myself away in college alone one night on Laylatul Qadr, then I'm not so sure I'll stay awake past midnight, at least not doing the same thing. And so our motivation to worship, it kind of comes when we are in a group. We need that. That is a crutch. And there are others, this is perhaps not as common a problem, but it also exists, who are able to get that motivation and that dedication and that sincerity alone, but when they're with a group, they can't do that. Then they don't want to be talking about Islam, and they don't want to be talking about God. They want to just have fun and spend time, and they can't really get that dynamic in their circle of friends and in the group to focus on their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is something that we have to work on, and we have to begin to appreciate. Where is it in our life that our relationship needs to be worked on? If I can get my motivation while I'm here in the center or when I'm with a group of friends, but when I go home, all of a sudden, the entire feeling wears off. I was going to say the high wears off. I don't want to use that term. The feeling of spirituality, it wears off, and all of a sudden, we're down just with ourselves, and we have to just pass the time. Then how can we work on that? How can we develop a relationship where we're comfortable with Allah, even when we're alone? Or if it's the other way around, if we're better at private than we are with a group. If we're more sincere in private than we are with a group, but when we're in a group, we're kind of embarrassed to say, well, let's go pray. Or why don't we head to the masjid, it's prayer time, and then we'll go wherever we were going. Then we have to work on that as well. Both of them are important. And I will just make a passing comment. One of the objections that we as followers of Ahlul Bayt have to those who pray Taraweeh prayers in the month of Ramadan is that this is something which was never done by the Prophet in this way. And that is something which even those who perform Taraweeh, they will admit. In books where the awwaliyatul khulafa are mentioned, for lack of a better term, the innovations, the novel ideas of the different caliphs are mentioned, including in Tarikhul Khulafa of Suyuti and other books. It is mentioned that أول من جمع الناس في شهر رمضان Umar, that Umar ibn al-Khattab, he was the first person to collect the people together for recommended prayers in the month of Ramadan in order to pray Taraweeh. So this is admitted. Our objection as followers of Ahlul Bayt that we have learned from Ahlul Bayt is that there are recommended supererogatory prayers that are not designed to be read in congregation at all. They are designed in order for us to develop an individual relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Prayers, congregational prayers, they have a different focus. That is not simply for me to connect to Allah, but it is for me to connect to Allah through and with my community. And that is why we have certain special rulings for congregational prayer, for our obligatory prayers. For example, I should go to a congregational prayer even if I'm not 100% sure that my intention is sincere. If there might be a little bit of an element of wanting to do it in public and be seen in public doing the congregational prayer, I should still go to the congregational prayer. If the congregational prayer is going to be slightly later than its ideal time, it is better for me to pray in congregation than to pray at the ideal time alone, according to many of our fuqaha. if the prayer in congregation is going to be shorter, with not as long a dhikr, not as long a dua, as a prayer that I can say alone. So should I do my fancy, very embellished prayer alone, or should I do the quick prayer in a congregation? Hands down, I should go in congregation. Because the congregational prayer, our obligatory prayers, they are there for us to connect to Allah, but through our community and with our community. So they have special rules. But then the supererogatory prayers, they are designed for a different purpose. We are also to have an independent relationship, an individual relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is where we should embellish our prayers as much as we want, with longer surahs and longer dhikr and dua and ta'qibat after the salat. That is something for us. To combine the two and say, well, because we have such beautiful prayers for Fajr and Dhuhr and Asr and Maghrib and Isha, therefore let's do the recommended prayers together as well. We won't have the masjid full of people doing their own thing. That destroys the whole purpose of the recommended prayers. It destroys what it is seeking to accomplish. The ideal that the Prophet would practice is that he would go out of his home and he would go to the masjid. So it was among his community, but he would pray his own prayers according to his spiritual state and what he had to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in the company, but separate from his companions and followers, he would ask them to do the same thing. So this is one of the things that I would like to focus on during these nights. And what we will do each night, we will speak and look at some of the prayers that have been recorded in the Quran from the prophets or the pious believers, or that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has encouraged us as Muslims to recite. Those brief words of dua and prayer that exist in the Quran, and we will look at what lessons we can learn from those du'as. This is one way that we will begin to appreciate how we can develop a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how we can begin to speak to Him by learning what is it that He has taught His pious prophets and messengers and the believers to speak to Him, in what terms, with what words, and asking for what things. So this is one part of our relationship that we will focus on. But let's not forget the other parts. To appreciate Allah's intervention and His grace within our lives. This is something which indirectly these prayers will also address. Because when Allah teaches people how to talk to Him, He is also teaching them how to talk to Him in accordance with how He wants to deal with them. But that is something which is indirect, and it is a separate area of focus, to understand Allah's sunan and His manner of dealing with humanity. But before we actually begin the individual prayers, which we will start with tomorrow inshallah, I would like to just briefly talk, very briefly, about some of those sunan and that divine conduct in running the affairs of the world. There is a contradiction that may appear in some of our minds between two different teachings that we have in Islam that are based in the Quran. Just to make sure that everybody is still with me, please recite a salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. On the one hand, we have the very clear instruction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's conduct and the way that He runs His affairs does not change. I believe in Surah Fatir we read, فَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَحْوِيلًا. You will never find for the sunnah of Allah a tabdeel or a tahweel. And that is an emphatic progression. A tabdeel means to substitute one thing for another. And so, for example, if in the olden days rebellion was punished by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and goodness was rewarded, then Allah will never substitute one manner of conduct for another. That if this is something which deserves reward or deserves punishment or deserves additional blessings, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not change how He deals with people and substitute one conduct for another. Everybody else had to work for salvation. Everyone else had to struggle to succeed materially and spiritually, but we should all get it on a special silver platter because we think that we are somehow better or separate from all of Allah's other creation. That is not how it is going to be. And then Allah goes one step further. He says, not only will nothing be substituted in Allah's conduct, but nothing will even be modified. Tahweel is more subtle than tabdeel. It's not substituting one thing for another, but moving one thing slightly from its place to a slightly different place. Allah will not even modify, slightly change His conduct. It's exactly the same. The laws that Allah has laid down in the creational world, as Shaykh Ilahi spoke, and also in the legislative world, those don't change. They are constant. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His wisdom and His running of the affairs of the universe, it is according to certain unchanging eternal principles. Now, the contradiction that may appear in our minds is that if Allah's sunan don't change, then what about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's constantly changing and every day being in a new sha'an? يَمْحُ اللَّهُ مَا يَشَاءُ وَيُثْبِتُ وَعِنْدَهُ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ. Allah, He obliterates whatever He may will, and He affirms whatever He may will, and He has that master plan and the master decree that He knows of Himself. Is there a contradiction between the two? Is there a non-changing sort of predetermined way that Allah is going to run all the affairs of the world? Or is there a divine change based on different circumstances? Does Allah have every day a new decree? To resolve this contradiction, we should go back a little bit and look at the different levels of conception of the belief in Allah that may exist. I want you to look at these different stages that I'm going to just very briefly talk about on two levels. One is intellectually. Intellectually, many of us are very well versed in Islamic theology, meaning we know that Allah, God, is not some old man with a big beard sitting on cloud 9 who kind of runs the affairs of the world. Intellectually, we know that's childish and that's not accurate. So one is intellectually, but the other is emotionally. Emotionally, many of us deal with Allah and think of Allah far, far more shallowly and superficially than if He were, na'udhu billah, an old man sitting on cloud 9 who sometimes intervenes in the affairs of the world. So let's look at it both emotionally and intellectually. There are those who don't believe in God, right? That nothing will create or destroy us illa dahr. It's only the material world and whatever exists in the material world. That's what caused us, and fortuitous circumstance, that is what brought us to life, and an unfortuitous circumstance, that's what's going to get rid of us. So it's just the material world. Now when we move past that abject, very callous, and very baseless materialism, then people, they begin to believe, all right, there's something there. The universe, there's a force in the universe. There's karma. What goes around comes around. There's something in the fabric of the universe that likes goodness and that dislikes evil. But it's a very nameless, faceless, it's not God. It's just something there in the universe. That is a very shallow recognition that there is something infinite and there is something, I won't call it infinite, there is something beyond the shallow material existence, but it has no relationship to our life. One step beyond that is sort of the God who created the universe and wound the clock. So He said that I will create, and He created, and then when He created, the world, it runs on its own. And so this conception of God kicks back and relaxes, and He may want to intervene in the world, but then He can't, because He's created these laws, and those laws work independently of Him. And so it's a creation that now He no longer has control over. And that is, on one level, sort of a deism that many people, they do subscribe to either intellectually or emotionally, and there can be a disconnect. Intellectually, when I just said that, all of us might say, no, that's not true. That's not, how can you limit God in that way? But emotionally, many of us deal with God that way. Yeah, He was the origin. He's done something. But then it's all working on its own. I have to get ahead by my own means in life. One step beyond that is the God who created, and then by and large the universe works pretty well. But sometimes things get messed up, and then God has to intervene. So he miraculously intervenes in our lives, or in the life of the world, right? It's like a restaurant who is owned by somebody who occasionally stops by, once every shift or once every couple of shifts, just to make sure that people aren't stealing from the cash register and that everything is stocked and taken care of, and then they leave and they go do their own thing. They have more important things to worry about than just this one restaurant. By and large, it works on its own, but sometimes they have to be there. If there's an extended absence, then everything gets messed up. That is another conception of God. The world works on its own, but sometimes God needs to intervene. For the big things, I need to go and pray. And then there is a further understanding of God, which is that there is no intervention that is greater or less than another. God is the actor at all times, and in everything that goes on in the universe, the small things and the big things. It is entirely running and working through the continued emanation and grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it is not that He performs miracles, but that all that exists is a miracle. It's not that if I want to, after my speech, and I'm sure you guys are looking forward to that moment, it's going to come soon, after my speech, if I'm going to go and sit back down on my chair, it's not that, well, that I can do on my own. But if I have to take a difficult entrance exam to college, that's when all of a sudden I should say, God, I need your help on this one. No. I need Him just as much to go back to my chair as I need Him to pass that difficult entrance exam. So this is the Islamic conception of God, and we will talk about how that relates to dua and the ahadith that we have and the wisdom that we have in coming nights. So with our Islamic conception of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what we are to understand intellectually and emotionally is that we need God and we need His intervention in every aspect of our life. Anything that goes on in the universe, in the creational world, or in the legislative world. It is through the auspices of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is through the running of His decree and through the running of His will. Nothing is independent. But that will, it has certain principles and certain laws that are unchanging. The fact that His laws are unchanging does not mean they are independent of Him, and it does not mean that He doesn't need to intervene. But it simply means that we can understand the wisdom behind His actions and we can develop a relationship with Him. Because in His interventions, He follows certain principles that we are there to get an insight into, to understand, and then to base our lives on. And so there is no contradiction. The Quran quotes the Jews as having said, وَقَالَتِ الْيَهُودُ يَدُ اللَّهِ مَغْلُولَةٌ غُلَّتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَلُعِنُوا بِمَا قَالُوا بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ يُنْفِقُ كَيْفَ يَشَاءُ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I believe in Surah Al-Ma'idah, the Jews, they said that God's hands are tied. May their hands be tied, and may they be cursed by what they have said or for what they have said. Verily, God's hands are unencumbered and unhindered, and He spends as He may wish. Now, some have said that this refers specifically to an accusation the Jews made sarcastically or seriously or in whatever way at the time of the Prophet, that what kind of God is this Prophet preaching? We're wealthy, and I'm not trying to follow a stereotype. The Jews in the time of the Prophet, they had Khaybar and they had agriculture and they happened to be wealthy. And the Muslims, especially in the beginning of the prophetic mission, not when Surah Ma'idah was revealed, but in the beginning of the Prophet's mission, they were by and large poor. And so some Mufassirin have said that the Jews, they would say, what kind of God is this Prophet preaching? His hands are tied up, and the Prophet has to say, مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يُقْرِضُ اللَّهُ قَرْضًا حَسَنًا? Who's going to give a good loan to God? Because the God that he is preaching towards can't even give himself a loan. He can't even fund his own projects. People need to help him. That is one interpretation, and that is somewhat supported by the fact that afterwards Allah says, يُنْفِقُ كَيْفَ يَشَاءُ. His hands are unencumbered and he spends however he may wish. But the surah was revealed towards the end of the Prophet's mission. Surah Al-Ma'idah, it was revealed after the conquest of Mecca, after the Battle of Hunayn, after the Muslims had acquired wealth. So it is probably better for us to take this verse in a more general sense and say that the Jews, they may have been, or those who said this, they may have said it specifically with regard to the poverty of some Muslims or the command for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Muslims to fund goodly projects, but it reflected a basic conception of God that they had. That God's hands are tied. And once He has set the affairs of the world in motion, if He has chosen a certain people, they're going to stay chosen until the end of time. If He has set a certain law and a certain qibla, then those laws are going to stay unchanged until the end of time. And if He has created something or decreed something, then that decree and that creation is going to stay until the end of time. And Allah answers not just the question about the funding of religious projects, but the entire conception and the worldview of those who raised that objection in this verse. Yadahu mabsutatan. Both of Allah's hands, meaning that entirely His authority and His power, it is completely unencumbered and He can do whatever He wants. And He does intervene in the affairs of the world without any hindrance and without any encumbrance. And so I would like to stop at this point. What we have covered today is basically an understanding of what aspects of our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala we want to work on. And we should introspect within ourselves to see what parts of our relationship do we need work on. Is it the individual part? Is it the collective or the group part? Is it both? What part of our understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do we need to focus on especially? Do we not know what it means for God to have Al-Asma'ul Husna, the beautiful names and the names of perfection? Or do we know, but do we not think of God that way? So that when we have problems in life, when we have needs in life, we don't really think to say, well, let me turn to Allah. We think, whose connections do I have? Who should I call? Who's on my speed dial list that I can call to get me out of this problem? When we want to pray, do we even stop to think, well, how does Allah want me to pray? Or do we just kind of say it however we may want to say it, and then we hold it against Allah when it's not answered the way we want it to be answered? That is, inshallah, what we will be looking at in the coming nights. I want to thank you for your patience with me, and inshallah, hopefully we will keep each other in our prayers. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow all of us to be able to benefit from the invitation that He has extended to each of us. The fact that we have passed already more than half of the month, and we have been His guests, that is a singular honor. May Allah continue the invitation for us. May we leave the invitation with our host being happy with us, because there are some guests who leave and their host says never again. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invite us again and again to this invitation in the company of our fellow believers. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.